I've been really, really excited about tonight's presentation for a long time. You know, I've preached a couple times on being cross-centered Christians. The center of a Pentecostal church is not the Holy Spirit, right? That's kind of a misconception. The center of our church is Jesus. The center of our faith is Jesus. It's all about Jesus. That's our old saying around here. And there's been a tool that the Spirit of God has used in my life for years to help keep my mind and my focus on the cross of Jesus Christ. And it's this artifact called the Shroud of Turin. If the Shroud of Turin was proven tomorrow to be a fake, my faith doesn't rise or fall on that. But I just want you to know that God has really used this in my life to kind of contemplate what Jesus Christ went through at the cross. And when I look at the cross and what Jesus went through, it's hard to be flippant with sin. Does it make sense? What I'm finding is the way to overcome sin is not to try to overcome sin. The way to overcome sin is to keep my focus on Jesus and His love and His grace and His sacrifice. And so that's why this evening I think God is going to use this presentation from Pat Patterson in a wonderful way. He was on the radio with us today. Anybody hear the radio thing? Okay, 4 of you. Thank y'all for supporting the radio ministry. All right, and some of y'all did text me because we didn't realize this. The microphones, we were in there before the radio program goes on, and they assured us the microphones were off, but they weren't. So we started getting texts from all over the place. Do you realize that your microphones are on? And I don't think we said anything too inappropriate. No. I think I called Pastor Chris a sissy. That was about the most inappropriate. He broke his leg and he's hobbling around. But at any rate, but I want to read this. This is just a little bit so you'll know about Pat. Pat has earned a bachelor's degree in professional photography from the Brooks Institute of Santa Barbara, California. While he was there, he was a research assistant to Professor Vernon Miller, who was on the Shroud of Turin research team that studied the shroud in 1977, 1978, somewhere around there. He has a career in commercial photography. He earned a degree in emergency medical science. He served 17 years as a street paramedic in Durham, North Carolina, and currently Pat serves as an associate professor of EMS at Wake Tech. His wife, Kim, and he live in Raleigh. They have been blessed with 2 handsome sons, 2 beautiful daughters-in-law, and 2 precious grandchildren. And so this is a great brother. He did a great job articulating this morning. Tonight you're going to be blessed. And so Pat, just come on up and start sharing with us, brother. Would you welcome Pat?
Hello, how's everybody? This guy is incredible. Now, we don't use the word idol often, but I listened to him on the radio. And when I first met him, it was from my sister Jane. Do y'all know Jane? Jane says, Pastor Chad has asked if you would come be a guest speaker and talk about the shroud. I'm like, what? Are you serious? He wants to meet you at Starbucks and talk about it. I said, when? So Chad and I met at Starbucks, and we sat there, and I was just kind of, in awe of this guy. I'm not trying to feed you on. I have a lot of respect for you. I love his messages. You guys are blessed with some wonderful pastoral team here. That said, y'all going to see me doing something a little different tonight. I'm going to be walking around with a microphone. My friend Lee in the back and I work together, and he went to a lot of lengths to record this for me, and I broke it right beforehand. So I'm going to be holding this. I want you to, you don't have to close your eyes, but I want you to close your mind, and I want you to think back 2,000 years. We know this happened. Our Savior went into the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed throughout the night. His blood pressure was so high that the tiny capillary beds in his skin and sweat glands ruptured. This is a medical condition called hematohidrosis. It's very rare. Every one of you have had your blood pressure checked. And your blood pressure was well below the maximum on that blood pressure cuff, which is 300. But it stops at 300. It could go higher. As a street paramedic, I had one patient whose blood pressure pegged at 300, and she had blood coming out of her eyes. She didn't have it coming out of the pores in her skin, though. So I want you to think of this. That night that Christ spent in Gethsemane was so stressful that he was rupturing and bleeding on the outside. Now you know the story. So a troop of guards came. They started slapping him around. beating him, hitting him. These weren't nice guys. They were rough guys. They were Romans elite. Of course, he was betrayed. Peter pulled out his sword and took a whack at the guy's head and missed and cut off his ear. Jesus healed it. The next thing that happened is incredibly brutal. And I'm going to show you some pictures tonight. And Chad, you're going to have to speed me up at some point because I just get going and I can't stop. Jesus Christ was tied around a post and he was whipped. Now you guys are familiar with the Roman, with the cat of nine tails. This is a brutal whip. But the Romans perfected it. The Romans did everything with perfection. And they beat him to the point of near death. Now, I've been a paramedic for 25 years, and I will tell you, if I had seen a patient beaten and then whipped to the point that he was with this Roman scourge, where chunks of flesh are being ripped out of his body, even with modern medical science, he might not have survived. Today, there was no medical science then. He would have died. So why did Christ have to go to the next step and get on that cross? And I'm going to show you some slides in a few minutes that might impress you, but this is not a pretty picture either. He's not hanging up there with a halo over his head. He's striving and suffering and bleeding, and his heart is under so much pressure. We talked about this morning, Pastor Chad, that it could not keep up with the pressure inside the chest, and it began to fail, and the arteries began to rupture as well, and fluid fills up that pericardial sac around his heart. It starts to fill up, put more pressure on the heart. And then because his heart is failing, the blood that should be going to the left ventricle and pumped back out in the body is backing up into his lungs, and the fluid is leaking out into his lungs. So he's developing something we call pulmonary edema. In short, he couldn't breathe. His blood pressure was dropping. He was already in profound hemorrhagic shock. And yet, this man God had the clarity to look out there and say 7 specific sentences. Am I right about that? One of them we know was, "Forgive them, Father." And every one of you, including myself, can say he was talking about me. So it's time for me to get into this before I turn it into a sermon. It's not meant to be. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish law. Then Simon Peter, I love Simon, I love Peter. The guy was bold, man. Simon Peter, who was behind John, arrived and went into the tomb, and he saw the strips of linen lying there. Now this was probably a very grave, kind of spooky place. But when they got in there, they didn't see Christ lying there. They saw the cloth. They saw the cloth that Christ had been wrapped in lying there, and the one that had been wrapped around his head was folded up. Now that's a picture of beauty, of serenity, of peace. And that cloth, from that point on, is never mentioned again in the Bible. But some people believe that it actually exists in Turin, Italy today, and it's called the Shroud of Turin, or Turin, depending on how you say it. I want to echo what Pastor Chad said. My faith, and I've been studying this shroud for 35 years, and every time I look at it and think about it and stare at this three-dimensional picture of it, I'll explain in a few minutes, this model, I'm just in awe. But if I found out tomorrow that it was totally a fluke, it would not affect my faith in Christ. I depend on you. I rely on you. If there's any point in this where you have a question, please raise your hand because I feed off of interaction. Otherwise, I'll keep moving. This is the known history. You know, we think centuries. The 20th century was the 1900s. The 21st century is the 2000s. So somewhere in the 6th century, around 500 AD, a cloth was discovered in the wall of the city of Edessa. And a legend was born. Now this legend has several names, but in this picture it's called the image of Christ, or the image of Edessa. And what it indicates is that somebody believes they saw a picture of Christ's face on a napkin And perhaps one of the legends is that when he was walking and fell down with that cross, somebody handed him a cloth and he wiped his face with it, and left an image on it. Now, if you saw The Passion of Christ, Mel Gibson actually put that into the movie. It's pretty well portrayed. That's one legend. There are other legends around it. I don't want to spend time on that. But what I do want to indicate to you is that when this surfaced, suddenly portraits of Christ began to change. Up until that point, the portraits of Christ were all very young looking, very innocent, a round face, no mustache, no beard, and they looked like this. These are actually mosaic tiles that you can find over in Europe today. I don't have them named. This particular one right here was done in the 5th century. Okay, right before that, the shroud, or that image of Edessa was found in the wall. Now, suddenly, portraits of Christ began to change. And here are 5 of 1,005 examples out there of portraits of Christ through the years, and every one of them looks like this now. Now, I'm going to show you some pretty remarkable things. Please notice this date again. This is the time period when that cloth was found in the wall of Edessa, and that's when this painting was made, and that's the one we're going to focus on. Watch this. If you take that and blow it up, this is kind of eerily mysterious, but watch this. Hello? I want you to focus on that right eye, that being the right eye, the bruise here on the cheek, what looks like a fracture in the nose, what looks like a forked beard, which looks like long nomadic hair, which looks like a long nose, which looks like a very beat up and drawn and exhausted individual. And let's look at this portrait again. And I'm going to back it up once, and we're going to do this again, because I want you to get the full effect. Portraits of Christ suddenly changed, and the idea is that when they saw this cloth, they began to say, that's Christ, that's his face. But where's the rest of him? I believe that the rest of him was folded up. This is just my theory. It's based on research, what I've heard other authors say. And I've got a cloth here I'm going to unfold in a few minutes. But if this were in some type of a frame, and that's all they saw, they would say maybe this is the face of Christ. But in a moment you're going to see it could be unfolded, and we can realize there's a whole lot more there. So it's a French crusader named Robert de Clary. This guy was a knight of the Knights Templar in 1203. Was the first time that the shroud in full length was reported having been seen. Now this shroud was passed around through the spoils of war. In other words, we found that it's ours now. Pastor Chad asked me today, when did the Roman Catholic Church come into possession of the shroud? Sometime in about the next 300 years. But for right now, the Knights Templar own it. And here's what I believe might have happened. You take off this frame and start unfolding it, and the shroud begins to reveal itself. Now this is one half of the Shroud of Turin here. And you will notice several things. I'm moving around because I realize I can't do this without being in your way. Please notice that what we have here is a front image of a man, his face all the way down to his feet. His arms are crossed across his body, and he basically is positioned like this in rigor mortis. Rigor mortis means the muscles have frozen. Now I want you to also notice these fold marks here. The way the shroud has been folded for centuries and centuries is going to leave these crease marks. I want you to also notice some other strange things here that look like a pattern of patches. I'm going to go ahead and give you a little history on that. In 1578, the shroud was moved to a more modern temple where it was stored. Not a temple, but a cathedral. And it was stored in a silver box, a silver vault, if you will. They only brought it out on very special occasions to show royalty, for example. That that chapel was caught up in a huge blazing fire that got so hot that it melted the silver box that it was in. And molten balls of silver burned their way through the shroud. And when they opened it, they realized they had a symmetrical series of holes, which would have helped to indicate how it was folded. So these patches here were actually sewn in by nuns. And this right here is actually a water stain. Here it is again at the bottom. You can see it other times across the shroud right here. These are water stains from the actual putting out of that fire. So what we're doing here is looking at the known history. Let me tell you a few things we know about the shroud for sure. The shroud is 14 feet, 3 inches long. And it's 3 feet and 7 inches wide. And it bears the recognizable image of a man, 5 feet 10 inches tall, about 170 pounds, who was Semitic in nature. He was a Semite, he was a Jew. And he has been beaten, scourged, and crucified in every way consistent with the gospel accounts of Christ's passion. Should I say that again? The Shroud of Turin has the evidence of a beating, a scourging, and a crucifixion in every way consistent with the gospel accounts of Jesus' passion. This is why a lot of people believe this is the burial cloth of Christ. There are other burial cloths that have been found out there, but none with these unique features, and none with all the features that we read about in the Bible every day. Now guys, today when you leave tonight, I don't want you to ever think of this as a pleasant, nice, peaceful experience. This was a brutal. In fact, there's 3 words I want you to think about. The Gethsemane experience for Christ was agony. He was praying in agony. The whipping was brutal. And the crucifixion was excruciating. What does excruciating mean? Sir, go ahead. Severe. Now, when in EMS, if I come up to you, sir, and I say, I'm sorry, you're having chest pain, how bad is that pain on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being the worst pain you've ever had, 1 being no pain or very little. If you said 10, that means to me this is the worst pain you've ever experienced. But I very rarely had anybody say to me, this is excruciating pain. The only thing I've ever had that I think was excruciating was a severe burn. It's nonstop, and it's just, oh, stop it. Christ went through excruciating pain for us on that cross. This is a picture of it. Whether or not this is Christ, some individual was crucified, and that's a picture of it. I love this picture because it gives you a good idea of how someone would have been placed in a shroud in order to leave an image like that. This was painted sometime in, I think, the 15th, 16th century. Now, there are people out there. We were talking about a famous artist named Walter McCrone. He's a scientist, and he has spent a large part of his career trying to prove that the shroud is a painting. Now, a little history on me real quickly. I worked with the Shroud of Turin research project under the chief scientific photographer, as well as the people who headed up the entire project from the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And one of the specific parts I worked on with them was the art history behind this and proving that it was not a painting. Let me give you a few reasons why it couldn't possibly be a painting. First of all, in order to paint this, even today, you'd have to stand at arm's length. When you're 3.5, 4 feet away from the shroud, it makes no sense at all. It's just a garbled bunch of images. You have to back away at least 10, 15, 20 feet. Now, my wife and I have stood 20 feet from the shroud and examined it. And even then, I think she'll agree, it's hard to make out all the details. This was a magnificent moment for me because I've been studying it for 30 years, and to be able to stand there and look at it. But it underlined to me that there's no way this could be a painting. There's no way you could paint it from that arm's length. Here's another. There's no evidence in the shroud of pigments or dyes. And the image itself of the shroud is limited to the very outer fibrils of that cloth. Now, what would happen if you took a paintbrush and took paint and applied it to a linen cloth? It would soak into the fibers. Another point about this is that there is actually evidence of human hemoglobin. Pastor Chad and I talked about this today, and he asked me during the radio interview about the DNA of the shroud. I went and looked up a little bit on that. I need to do some more studying. There is evidence of human male hemoglobin on the shroud. There's also evidence of human female DNA on the shroud, which indicates that people have contaminated it throughout the years. DNA has yet to get to the point, DNA testing, where we can say, yes, this was a man. Okay, you understand what I'm saying? All right? But there is blood. Now, this is also cool. Any of you from the 60s will remember the black light posters. And those of you from the 2000s have missed out on a really cool age, okay? We used to walk into our bedrooms, we'd have these black light posters on our wall, we'd turn on this purple light, it's actually a UV light, and it would glow. Now, this is cool. If the shroud had been a painting, painted in the 12th century when they say it was forged, it would have been used or painted with egg tempera. Now, egg tempera was the paint of the times. It's made out of egg yolks and whites. I'm not sure exactly which. I need to research that more, but it's rich in proteins. That's the point. And when you make a painting out of egg tempera, it fluoresces very brightly like a black light poster. But guess what? The shroud image does not. So you say, how do you know? You can't go back and test an ancient painting. Well, yes, I can. We went to the artifacts chamber at the University of California in Santa Barbara and found a 12th century Bible. Actually found two. The curator let us open them up, turn on our black light, turn off the overhead lights, and the little paintings on each page, you know, in the beginning the eye is painted, just black light. So the shroud image does not fluoresce. Couldn't be a painting. Imagine it going to the North Carolina Art Museum, taking the most valuable painting they've got, taking it down and folding it, folding it, folding it, folding it, folding it, and doing this for decades. What would happen to it? Paint would crack off. There's no evidence of cracking. And this is the one that really started the modern research in 1898. It was discovered that the shroud image is actually a photographic negative. There was an amateur photographer named Secondo Pia who was commissioned to come in with his tripod and set it up after the exhibition finished and actually take pictures. His first set of negatives were ruined, so he got to come in and do a second round. This time it worked. When he processed the negatives, he realized that what he was looking at was something much easier to read, much clearer. And actually, he says, wait a minute, this is a positive. That means the shroud itself is a negative. Now, I got another slide that will help you to understand this. If we were to take a picture of this young man and produce a photographic negative, it would look like that. We don't have photographic negatives anymore. You use digital, but you guys have seen film, right? And I did not mean for that to say I used to process lots of color film, but watch this. It actually proves to us that the shroud is a photographic negative. Now, the photographic negative was not even conceived until the 1850s. So, could someone like Michelangelo or Da Vinci or some genius paint a photographic negative? I suppose so. But it wouldn't have some of the other important characteristics. I'm going to tell you one in a few minutes. I'm going to explain to you that the shroud contains three-dimensional information. No painting does. What questions do y'all have before I move on? I don't want to overwhelm you without giving you a chance to ask a question. Yes, sir?
Why haven't you been able to do any DNA testing on the shroud currently?
Well, they have done some. Okay, it's been limited. It's not produced the results that they wanted. Okay, they did some.
Governments?
Well, no, the government has nothing to do with it. Actually, the Roman Catholic Church decides who can and cannot come in and do a test on the shroud. And they're very protective of this thing. During its downtime, it's stored in an airtight, air-conditioned vault, fireproof. I mean, it's got its own security system. It's a holy relic. So if you and I were to say, we want to do a test on the shroud, they say, so? So I know there are going to be more testings in the future, and I can't wait for them to be revealed. But as of yet, the testing on this has been very limited. Yes, sir?
Have they stopped folding it? So is it stored completely flat?
It's, as I understand it, today it's stored flat, okay? It's actually stored on a velvet, with velvet, okay? So it's wrapped entirely in velvet and extremely well preserved. You're going to see a few pictures in a moment that'll help explain that. Yes, sir? It's very, very consistent with it. I'm going to show you a few pictures in a minute. Are we doing okay on time? Listen, when a person dies, there's a series of events that take place in their body that cause the muscles to lock up. And if that chin happened to be locked open, I've seen that. Some of you have seen that. We don't want our Savior buried like that. So what they do is they actually close it and wrap a cloth around the top and tie it. And this is consistent with burial customs back then. So we had a team of researchers come. This is the St. John Battista Cathedral in Turin, Italy, where Kim and I went to visit the Shroud. And in 1977, a group of researchers from around the world were allowed 3 days to analyze this thing. They brought in 3 tons of equipment and 30 different specialists from around the world, and they spent 3 days studying. Now this shows how they brought it out. That shows the red velvet. Now this is an amazing part for me too. I've actually got a piece of that red linen right there in my safe at home. They also gave me a piece of that gold foil. Guess what Pat did with it? He lost it. But they did a lot of research. This is Max Fry's looking for the pollen samples we were talking about. They're looking under the cloth. They're examining the fibrils. They're using microscopic tests. They're doing photosensitivity, and they're doing spectral densitometry, things way over my head. They're checking it in every possible way they can in as fast a fashion as they can to bring it back to the United States and start studying it. Now, I happen to work with this gentleman right here. This is Vernon Miller. He was the industrial photography department head at Brooks Institute of Photography, where I got my degree in photography. Vern was, he spent his whole time photographing this, and he brought his negatives back, and I got to work with him on those negatives. This is John Jackson. He was the man who headed up this project. And in 1980, I had a wonderful opportunity to go spend a week at his house with his wife and a good friend of mine named Bill and work with him on some of these different tests. So I consider myself an assistant to the geniuses behind this whole research project. This shows how it might have been wrapped, to answer your earlier question. This just shows some of the different ways that they tested this to see, what is the shroud? And this is especially interesting to me because one of the tests they did was they wanted to see if you put a person in this position and then compare it to what you see on the shroud, is it obvious that where the cloth contacted the skin, you see greater detail? Well, they used me for part of this test. Here I am bearing it all for y'all. This is 35 years ago. But this guy actually, he was so dedicated to his science that his wife allowed him to use the dining room table as a piece of plexiglass. And they had me lie on top of that plexiglass and get in the exact position of the man in the shroud. And then they got under the table and looked up at it to see, hey, look at the astonished look on their faces. They realized that wherever my back is pressed against the glass, more on this side than on that, because one shoulder's raised a little bit more, then that's exactly what they see on the shroud. There's no way a painter could have known this. So this is one of the ways that it helps them determine what actually caused. One of the theories is that the burial ointments that were quickly applied impregnated the cloth, and over time they darkened and caused the image. There's another theory going along with that the shroud image has actually reached its peak, and it's starting to decline, and in another 500 years it may not even be there. We live at an important time in history. This is cool stuff. There was a man named Joel Schumacher who developed a machine for NASA to send back pictures of the surface of Mars. And by taking these pictures, they could scan them and they could determine the elevations on Mars, the mountains and so forth. Now you can do this with a photographic negative or a picture, and on most pieces of flat art you get a flat raised area. But the shroud, scientifically, unexplainably, has three-dimensional information that can be transferred into an image that matches the shroud. Now this is not the perfect lighting for this. Perfect lighting for this is from the side. I've tested it, there's no way to get it. But this is actually a rendering directly from that scan. And I keep it at home, very safe, because this is precious to me. Sometimes I'll sit in my man cave upstairs and just look at this thing. I mean, seriously, just look at it for 10, 15 minutes and start wondering, wait a minute. If this is the burial cloth of Christ, that's what he looked like. I get shivers just saying it. And this is a picture that I took with John at 3 in the morning. Real quickly, we're getting ready to get into the trauma behind this thing. This is the last part. 3 in the morning, everybody else is asleep in the house. Bill's in bed, John's wife's in bed, and John says, let's take a picture of the model. He's got a full-length model of that in his living room. I said, okay, I don't have any lights. He said, that's right, we'll do a time exposure. So I measured it, and I was a photography student at the time. I knew I'd do this stuff, reciprocity and all that. 45 minutes. So we set up the tripod, clicked it, flipped it over, sat down, you know, don't want to vibrate it. And we looked at that thing for 45 minutes while it recorded to get that picture. The lighting was the lighting around the corner in the dining room, one in the hallway down there. But the neat thing was, every now and then I'd glance over at John, he had this big smile on his face. He's thinking what I'm thinking. This could be Christ. So they conclude this is not the product of an artist. It has human hemoglobin. We think that the burial ointments applied to the body may have impregnated the cloth and darkened with time, but we're just not sure. Other tests have been run, other theories have been deducted. No one can say for sure how the shroud image was formed. Now let's get into the meat of this matter. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. This is Gethsemane. And this is a realistic picture of what Christ went through for you and me. He was praying for us that night, y'all. In fact, if you read the account in John, you know that he was actually praying also for his disciples. He knew what they were going to be going through. His blood pressure was spiked. He had a headache. He knew what was coming. He also knew he was born for this. And Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. That's all John said. Why? Because they knew what a flogging was. Now, it was likely that they had 2 floggers, one on each side. Whoosh. Take turns. Your turn. Go. Whoosh. 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 Let's get his legs. Let's turn him around and get his front side. What was the word I used to describe the flogging? Brutal. These were brutal men. They were animals. And I think the Bible has a word to describe them. It wasn't animals, it was beasts. What was it, Chad? This was a horrible experience. Now, the archaeological findings have shown us that cats and nine-tails might look something like this. Very crude, sharp, wicked things that we cut the skin. But the Romans were more likely to use one like this. From archaeological finds, this is a model that was made, a photograph that I did, and we actually measured these and compared them to the injuries on the shroud and found out that this matches. It was such a brutal form of punishment, it was not used for Roman citizens. Now, if you compare the shroud, all those little wound marks on there, you'll see the same shape applies right here. So we've got archaeological findings that match up to little dumbbell-shaped wounds on the back of the shroud and the front of the shroud. And there's a close-up of them. Lots of blood. Now, I want to give you a picture here. This is not a pretty sight. When you take a little dumbbell like that of lead, which is a new metal back then, basically, that they learned how to manufacture, to mold, and hit somebody with it, it bruises the subcutaneous tissues, it ruptures capillaries, and when you hit enough times, it starts to rip out chunks of flesh. This causes severe inflammation. In fact, if we did it one time on your back, it quite likely could bruise your underlying ribs. I mean, not your ribs, but your lung underneath that rib. This is incredible trauma here. The inflammation is going to cause fluid to shift outward in the body, away from the bloodstream and the cells where it needs to be. This is going to start affecting your ability to maintain a blood pressure. And I'm going to tell you this again, and I will go to my grave for this. It is very likely that getting 102 lashes with the shroud like this would have killed Christ alone. So why was the cross even necessary? Humiliation. Christ knew what was coming. He was exhausted at this point. And these show that you have lash marks in this direction and in that one. So the shroud is not only anatomically correct with human blood, 170 pounds, 5 feet 10 inches. It's got real details on it. It matches exactly what we see in the Scriptures. They twisted together a crown of thorns and put them on his head. This also was not pretty. This is what it most likely looked like. It was a crown of thorns, and these weren't little rose thorns. Pinus Christus, I'm not saying that right. Pinus Christi is a thorn that's native to that area that gets as much as 3 inches long. And I had a picture on there and I deleted it. Wicked thorns. I want you to imagine these not only being placed on your head, but the Scriptures tell us they took a staff and hit him. They're gouging this thing down into his head. Now, you guys have heard of nerves. We have a set of cranial nerves in our body that take care of all the sensations in our face and scalp and our eyes and our ears and so forth. The largest one is called the trigeminal nerve, and it detects pain sensations around the face and the scalp. When you take a crown of thorns and put it on someone's head and gouge it down and hit it, again, the pain is unbelievable. Prophesy, Jesus. Who hit you this time? They're beating him, adding injury to insult. And by doing so, they're doing things like they're causing severe hematomas on his cheek. They're maybe knocked out teeth. The Bible doesn't mention that. Breaking the nose. Now this is okay. The Bible tells us that none of Jesus' bones would be broken, but it's an anatomical truth that if you break the nose right here, you're breaking cartilage. The nasal bone is just slightly above where you see that injury right there. Christ didn't have a single bone broken. Let me rephrase that. The man on the Shroud of Turin had no bones broken, but does have a broken nose. Now, you can't hit someone with enough force like that without also causing some internal injuries in the head. Possible some cerebral contusion, some minor bleeding inside his brain, severe headache, probably some blurred vision. This is not pretty. I'm a paramedic, folks. I've seen this stuff. I haven't seen people treated in this way. I'd much rather get shot 3 times than go through what this man went through. Broken nose. And here comes the icing on the cake. He's going to die. But let's finish this. I know Satan was having a blast because he didn't know what was coming Monday morning. Amen?
Amen.
Golgotha was the place of the skull, and I've seen pictures of it. You have too, some of you. It looks like a skull from a distance. It looks like 2 eyes. And I've read reports that there was, the crosses were actually positioned close to the edge. Thousands of people were crucified up here. And when they were finished, they cut them down. They weren't very high. Quite often people would be crucified this far off the ground. So their feet are this far off the ground. So people can come out and spit at them and talk to them and laugh at them and tickle them and tease them, and dogs could nip at them, lick their blood. And then they would push them off the cliff when they're dead, and their bones, they'd fall in the boneyard down there and rot. This was a smelly, bloody, awful place. This is what he would have looked like carrying his part of the cross up the hill. I don't know the distance from the Praetorium where he was beaten and so forth up to Golgotha, but I believe it was a good distance. Christ was already in shock. He was already extremely weak. He had a headache. His blood pressure was dropping, and this thing weighed 90 pounds. Now, we don't know at which point they nailed him to this patibulum, but it wasn't yet, because the gospel tells us that he fell and could not carry it anymore. He was that weak. And they had to have someone else carry it up for him. So he was not yet nailed to this thing, but he will be in a minute. This is a neat picture from the 1500s showing how it would have happened. There's also an area of abrasion on the shoulder consistent with someone carrying something heavy over their shoulder. The shroud is full of details. So you ask me, do I believe this is the burial cloth of Christ? It sure doesn't match up with what I see in the Scriptures. They crucified him, period. And again, that's where we get that word excruciate. I teach EMS, I teach medicine, so I'm huge on Latin and Greek origins of words. And I've never, since I realized this, never looked at the word excruciating the same again. It comes from the cross. This was the most brutal form of punishment that man had conceived. And I want you to think about this. These Roman guards that did these crucifixions were experts. They knew exactly where to place the nail in the wrist in order to achieve maximum pain, to make it more difficult to breathe. I'll explain this in a minute. And so that it wouldn't rip out. Now, if you take a nail and put it through the palm and suspend somebody's weight from it, it'll rip out. But not if you put it right here. This has been proven with cadavers. Got an x-ray here to show you in a minute. Lots of pictures, thousands of pictures. You can Google this yourself. These are 3 different ways that people might be crucified. Not one of them that looks comfortable to me. And this one may be even the most accurate for this reason. Do you notice how the legs are bent? Try this when you get home. I can't find some bare wall, but try this when you get home. Stand with your back flat against the wall. Put your knees together. Go down so your knees are bent at a 90-degree angle and see how long you can hold that. And now, while you're doing that, imagine that a nail is driven through your feet. The pain is shooting up these large nerves into your spine and going up into the base of your brain and literally exploding and causing spasms. And so I can't stand this weight any longer. I've got to stand up. And when I do, it relieves my legs, but it puts all the weight. Let me do this. I did it backwards. When I drop, it puts all the weight on my hands. I can't stand this anymore. When I stand up, it takes the weight off my hands, but it puts all the weight back on those feet. No way to gain comfort. I've been beaten. My lungs have been bruised. It's hard to hang like this and breathe anyway, but when your heart is under that much pressure and the arteries in it have already ruptured from the high blood pressure, that sac around my heart is starting to fill up. My heart cannot keep up, and it can't pump the blood out, and the fluid is leaking into my lungs, and I can't breathe. Jesus Christ died this way. The man in the Shroud of Turin died of what we call asphyxiation. There's 2 reasons we breathe, y'all. One is to get oxygen in. Another is to blow off CO2, carbon dioxide. In our body all day long, watch this. Here's why we breathe. Our oxygen levels come down, our CO2 levels come up. We breathe. 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 But Jesus got to the point where his CO2 got higher than his O2, and he can't breathe fast enough, and his O2 levels are dropping, his oxygen levels are dropping, he's becoming weaker and weaker by the moment. He dies. So this is actually the picture of the wrist. This is an x-ray image of a real person showing the space of death spots I was telling you about. If you put a nail right there and drive it in, as these Roman soldiers knew to do, not only would it support the weight of the body, but it would also cause maximum pain. These guys were brutal. Notice that there are no thumbs evident. If a Michelangelo, Da Vinci type person painted this shroud, he or she knew that if we put a nail in here, it's going to cause the thumbs to contract. If you do that on a cadaver, it causes that median nerve, causes the thumb to actually come inward and freeze there. The shroud is full of details. Now, on the shroud, there's evidence that there were 2 nails put into the feet. One of them right in the center of the foot. And I don't know about you, but tonight when you go home, if you've ever done this, I want you to go home and I want you to find the surface right between your bones, up near the top of your foot, and push down hard. It's very painful. I just did it. That hurts. And that's where that first nail was placed, right there. Try that tonight. I promise you it'll hurt. Second nail driven through here. Now, question, don't I keep saying that not a bone of his would be broken? Archaeological finding. I took it out of this because I didn't want to overwhelm you with images. Now I wish I'd left it in. They found a heel bone with a nail through it where the bone had not broken. He pierced it without breaking it. It's possible. So this is Jesus standing up on those legs, relieving the pressure on his hands. But the pain is so intense here as he stands on these nails that he has to drop. He has to bend his legs again, and it puts all the weight up on those arms. So this is an exercise he went through. It's excruciating. I can't find comfort. Who's ever had a kidney stone? I don't care what position you get in, you can't relieve the pain. And this was excruciating pain. There's also another key point here. The shroud has evidence of blood flowing in trickling in 2 directions on his arm and wrist. You see that? And that could be because I'm hanging like this, and then I'm hanging like that, you see? So these are details that a clever artist would never, ever be able to think of. See, these guys were worried about getting these criminals off the crosses before 3 o'clock. Because that's when the Sabbath began. I guess that's right, the Passover. The Jewish law said, got to get them off. We'll be violating the law if they're up after 3. Break their legs. Take a baseball bat, a club, break their legs, and they will drop. All the weight's on their arms now. They can't breathe. They're going to die faster. But y'all know the story when they came to Christ, he was already dead. So what did they do? I mean, these guys were sadistic. The devil was in this. The devil wanted Christ dead. Again, we know what's coming. Chad and I originally talked about doing this at Easter. But I'm okay with this, man. It's Christmas. Merry Christmas, by the way. For these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled. A bone of him shall not be broken. No ambulances. So Chad, we take this spear, we jab it into his side just for further insult to make sure he's gone. And that thing goes in to that heart that's surrounded by fluid right now. And those lungs that are filling up with water. And you get a gush of water and blood flow out. Interesting that the scriptures would actually document that. Lee and I are paramedics. We understand the anatomy and physiology behind that. It just adds so much clarity to me as to what our Savior went through for us. So here it is. They brought him down. Joseph of Arimathea, that's hard to say fast, was a Jew. He was a wealthy man. He was a friend of Jesus. He went to Pilate and begged for his body. He says, I want his body, I want to bury him. Pilate said, go ahead. So Joseph put him in an expensive cloth, herringbone twill, the same picture I showed you earlier, that little of the fibers. And this is where the story ends, because we know that about 44 hours later, when they went back to the tomb, I've done the math, about 44 hours later, they came at 8 or 9 in the morning, Christ was gone. The tomb was empty. The shroud was lying there and just in a mess. I was going to do this earlier. Kim, can you help me? This is just a mock-up that I made. I wanted to give you an idea of how big it actually is and what it would look like to Peter and them. If you'll take that part and walk that way, be careful not to fall. My lovely assistant. Also my best friend. And okay, we're going to turn this, you guys can see it, but this, hold it nice and tight. This is the size of the shroud. Now, I did this upstairs in my house with a brown pencil, so don't give me too much grief for the image. Okay, Kim, let's turn it this way a little bit. Y'all see it? And let's turn it that way for them. Can y'all see it? Okay, now come this way. I need one volunteer. If you'll set it down on the floor. Just lay it out flat. And sir, when they were, thank you, Kim. When I was at John Jackson's house involved in these experiments in the Shroud of Turin, and people are saying, this is the burial cloth of Christ. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I got to thinking, I am being used in an experiment to determine whether a cloth was the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. They were just wrapping me in a piece of sheet. But the whole thing gave me, again, chills just to think that I had the privilege of being involved in something as momentous as this. So I would like for you to lie down on this, put your feet right here, if you don't mind. You okay with this? I don't care. I don't care. This thing, the DNA on this is already messed up. Okay, slide this way a little bit. Here, give me a hand. Perfect. Now I want you to bend this leg just slightly, kind of cross it over that one, just like that. And I want you to take this hand and place it right over that one, and I want you to pull your thumbs in. And I'm going to pull this over you. He's never going to forget this. Now remember, we're in a hurry, y'all. And so we're just going to throw these burial ointments in here real quickly. And we're going to come back Sunday morning. And we're going to finish preparing him for burial. When we come back, he's gone. Okay. He was waiting for the dramatic climax. So in summary, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, which was made up of 30 individuals who were geniuses in their areas of study, came together for 3 days back in 1977, got together all the materials they needed for the next 35 years of research. And they say, we don't know what happened. We don't know how he did this. I don't think we'll ever know. I think that if Christ left his image on there, it's going to be a mystery until we meet him. But the neat thing for me is that we are sitting here talking about our Savior Jesus Christ, what he went through. I've had the privilege of giving this lecture to lots of different audiences. One of them was a trauma conference at Duke University. And the results were pretty interesting. They passed around surveys at the end, 0 to 5. 0 means you hated it, 5 meant you loved it. And almost, of about 50 people that are in there, about 25 of them were 5s and 25 of them were 0s. What does that tell you? This is controversial. Christ is controversial. But I got to share, you saw the gospel up there. I got to share the gospel at Duke University Trauma Conference. I got to share the gospel here tonight. So wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And Chad, again, I thank you. And if you guys have any questions at all, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Talk about the image of the side. We can see that on the shroud as well.
Yes, you can. Let's see, Chad. Let's advance this one more slide. Right here. That's actually blood. That's human hemoglobin right there. And then all these scourge marks throughout the body. So that would be the side that was actually driven with the lamps.
Any questions for Pat? We're going to have just a quick time of prayer and discussion, but this is fascinating stuff. Quick questions. Anybody have anything we need to clarify? Over here. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell me the timeline between the flogging and his death?
Like how long between the flogging and his death?
When the flogging began and then the spear.
Okay.
You, sir.
Yeah, and we all know that it was, Jesus was put on the cross at 9 o'clock. So all this had to have taken place before 9 o'clock in the morning. And Pat, you are right. Those of y'all who can go to Israel with us this next year, we're going to walk the path between the Praetorium, where he was flogged, and the hill of Golgotha. And it's about, I think, 3/4 of a mile, and it's pretty much uphill the whole way. So, and even us not being flogged and with nothing on our back, we kind of got winded making that walk. It's just, it's incredible to think about Jesus after going through what he went through, making that journey. So good question. Yes, sir.
So it was about 6 hours then?
Yeah, he was on the cross about 6 hours. Yeah, the Jewish Passover began at 6 o'clock, so he is killed at 3 o'clock, just in time for everything to pile, get in the body and that type of thing.
So I
Yeah.
have a question for Pat then with that information. In
A ruptured spleen, the spleen is one of those organs that's extremely vascular. And are you asking that because of the location of this?
Because of the flogging itself.
Okay, she's bringing up a really good point, y'all. A lot of your major organs are protected by your rib cage. Now, if you hit somebody hard enough to cause a severe bruise here and a broken rib, it will bruise the underlying lung. Okay? And in this case, the spleen is actually located back here on the left side, not very well protected. And it could very well be that the spleen was ruptured as well. How long can a person live with a ruptured spleen? It would depend on the amount of bleeding going on. Okay? The spleen itself holds about a pint of blood. And so you would start leaking out initially a pint of blood, but over time you could bleed out theoretically within your abdominal cavity.
Wow. Great question. Thank you. Good. Yes, sir.
The cloth, there was a separate cloth that covered the face, is that correct? That was folded?
Well, the gospel indicates to us that there was a second cloth that was about the face, folded up in a place by itself, which indicates that there were angels ministering to Christ. But if you remember, there was one picture I had that showed that possibly that was the one that was wrapped around here. Nobody knows for sure.
Yeah.
But that's also behind the ledge, and that's one of the other theories of what caused the image of Odessa was that it had been across his face. So nobody knows for sure.
Pat, talk about the coins over the eyes as well, and some of the...
It was a common practice if you were a wealthy person burying someone back in that time that you would take a coin, place it over each eye in order to keep the eyes closed. It was a measure of respect. If you didn't have money, you would use a rock. Joseph was a wealthy man. Now this is not worked out yet with enough clarity, but there are some computer images that show some images of a staff right over one of these eyes that's consistent with the coins that were minted during Pontius Pilate's reign. And so some of the indications on there was that there were actually coins placed over the eyes as well. Yeah. More fascinating details.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was there, sure it was, any kind of carbon dating?
Yes.
A lot of faith in that either.
Well, you can put a lot of faith in carbon-14 dating if it's done under extremely controlled circumstances with something that hasn't been contaminated. Now, in 1988, there were 5 different laboratories around the world that were allowed to do carbon-14 from samples that were taken from the cloth, and they compared the results and came up with something around the 1300s. And everybody goes, oh. In fact, let me show you a slide. Hurry up. Look at this guy. Hey, it's 1260 to 1390. The shrouds are fake. But what he doesn't show you is that the portion that was taken for the sample was on the edge of the cloth where a lot of threads had been sewn back in. Now remember, I told you the shroud has been passed down through time, that the nuns have now taken over care of this thing for the 1500s on, and they've re-sewn and sewn the edges of this thing numerous times. The shroud has also been the spoils of war. It's gotten dirty. It's had people touching it. It's got human DNA on here, female DNA over there. There's no way to get a clean carbon-14 dating from this thing. So I don't think, even if they took a sample from the face, but in order to take a sample, you've got to go in there with a pair of scissors and cut it off. Say, here, go have fun. Do you think the Roman Catholic Church is ever going to allow any more carbon-14 dating on the shroud? I don't. Not until they can do it from a single thread. I don't put a whole lot of stock in that.
Yes, ma'am.
You talked about, I think you mentioned how the image could be from a life or a
Yeah, there's one theory, and Pat and I discussed this a little bit, that it's a scorch, and that possibly at the moment of resurrection, a burst of radiation was emitted, and that image was burned on there. That's one theory, Pat. I know you're talking about the spices.
And the nuclear radiation is a conceivable idea, okay? But the scorch is not. Again, if you take a piece of linen, this is another test we did in the laboratory. If you take a piece of fine linen and scorch it to burn it, leave a brown image, it fluoresces. The substance it produces is called furfural. It's a scientific word. But the furfural actually fluoresces under UV radiation. So that's one of the reasons that we can say we don't believe it's from a scorch. That's one of the theories that the STURP crew actually considered.
Good. Gang, yes, one more, Dan.
Yeah,
And then back up
there. We look at the prophecies and numbers, and we look at the likelihood that those prophecies could possibly have ever happened, and it's astronomical. So as you look at, and you've done all this research on the crowd, the chances that somebody would be crucified and flogged and still have coins over the eyes and things like that, this must be pretty
I would think.
One thing would happen, but another wouldn't.
Right.
Things like that.
And again, this is unique, and it's the only burial cloth with all these recognizable clear images and all the details that we see in the shroud. So it's not coincidence. Y'all, thank you so much. I know we're out of time. Pastor Chad has something else for you.
Pat, thank you. And I tell you, if you don't mind, Pat, would you and Kim, and I know you got some books here, you're an author as well, you can be something. In fact, go out to your book table when we get through and stand out there. And even if
This
you
wasn't
don't
my
got a book-
idea.
Yeah, that's his
My
wife's
wife's
idea to help make house payment this
Yeah.
week. And so bless us all, y'all help. But when you get through, Pat's going to be out there, and just go by and talk to him if you have any questions. Let's do this because we'd like to end out in prayer. Look at everybody get one of the study guides here. On one side we have our missionaries. Every Wednesday night we pray for a different missionary. Take this home, pray for them. Table leaders, help us just with that second question. Let's just hit that second question and then just for a few moments talk about this and then close out in prayer because we are out of time. But let me explain what the second question is. A famous Christian psychologist said, every counseling issue I have had to deal with either goes back to the inability to receive God's grace or extend God's grace. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Divorce issues, self-esteem, all this, the inability to receive God's grace or to extend grace.